For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 5, Episode 16 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami, a second set of recollections of Stephen Harrison, starts now.
This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Stephen had such an ability to see well ahead of many people and put the things in place to be able to accomplish them and to, stay optimistic, the happy warrior that he was.
Knowing Stephen, he aimed big, and so he tried to pull everybody together, and he succeeded in NAIL-NIT doing so in quite a number of responses together, and I think that's what's unique about NAIL-NIT.
I think he changed in a really impressive way was the very practical process of patient recruitment into NASH, now MASH studies. So he largely created with the first iterations of Summit the idea of site network.
Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book called The Tipping Point, which is about how ideas take shape. Right. And he identified there being three specific kinds of individuals who make things happen. Many people are one of those. A few people are two of those. Virtually nobody is three of those, which made Stephen kind of a unicorn.
Yes.
Because he was all three.
I will be forever grateful for all the times he held space so that I could come in or bring a patient voice in or a patient perspective. Often then he'd follow up and back me up by data or with something else to further lift the point I was making.
I'm not intending here to talk about multiple articles that he wrote and how he changed the overall field from a very depressive area when everything was failing to, I believe, a current situation. He was very able and willing to jump around into another, so to say, less important and completely unclear in terms of regulatory pathway disease, just to bring something new to the field.
Last month, our global community of steatotic liver disease stakeholders lost a giant when Stephen Harrison passed away suddenly at the age of 55. As part of our ongoing memorial to Stephen, today hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Jörn Schattenberg, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and our guests, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dimitar Tonev, and Global Liver Institute founder and CEO Donna Cryer, share memories of Stephen, this week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Remember to keep listening after the episode for this week's question of the week, sponsored by Madrigal Pharmaceuticals.
Hi, it's Roger Green. This week's episode is different in a couple of ways. We set out to do a memorial to Stephen Harrison, but with non-KOL stakeholders. The two people we invited were our good friend Donna Cryer, to whom Stephen introduced me and who co-hosted with Stephen, Louise, and me for about a dozen fantastic episodes of Surfing MASH during Season 1. And Dimitar Tonev, who wrote such a moving tribute to Stephen on LinkedIn, which I've read as part of one of our weekly newsletters. We know that Jörn only had one 30-minute time slot available, and that Louise is in the remote parts of Australia without cell service, so she couldn't join us at all. Then the fun started. First, Dimitar was traveling after Digestive Disease Week 2024 and lacked adequate bandwidth to connect to Jörn, Donna, and me, which meant we had to have two separate conversations in this episode, one with Donna and Jörn, and the other a one-to-one with Dimitar and me. Then we lost Dimitar's high-resolution recording somewhere in the ozone of Riverside, so Mike has endeavored mightily to gain maximum clarity from a lower-resolution recording. With all that said, I think these are excellent conversations and that you will enjoy them thoroughly. Just one thing before you start. If you would like to record a conversation with one of the co-hosts about your memories of Stephen, or would like to write us a note about him, we'll post the note to our memorial page and release the interview as a special conversation. Just write to let us know. Send it to me directly at roger.green@hepdynamics.com. And now, here's our first conversation with Donna and Jörn. And with me right now, I have Jörn, who kind of fell off after the last call, fell off internet. And then we have Donna Cryer, to whom Stephen introduced me in the first place, and who's been has been involved with Stephen for many different ways over the years. Let's do a quick groundbreaker. One good thing that happened in the last week. I know you've each got one. I've got one. And then we'll take one question that Jörn wasn't around for last time, and then we'll dive in from there. Whoever wants to go first, groundbreaker.
Well, I am certainly grateful and still excited about the 10th anniversary. That's the Global Liver Institute's 10th anniversary of existence, our celebration, the kickoff event for a series of four global events to really both say thank you to everyone for the past 10 years of support, to having gotten us to where we are now, and really asking people to step up and deepen the commitment for the next 10 years for the future of liver health and beyond. So, but Saturday night was an incredible event, high energy, well-intended, and just so many opportunities from people who supported GLI from its very earliest days to, the current moment. I'm grateful for opportunities to say thank you, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. Okay, Jörn?
Well, congratulations, Donna. That's quite a story. And GLI has really shaped the field and left its footprint. I cannot share a big professional moment. I guess I've been following DDW from a distance a little bit with excitement. There's some data being presented today, so that's great. We had a bank holiday here yesterday, Pentecost, so I just started my week now, which is personal highlight, making it a short week, and here I am meeting Donna again for some time on the podcast, which is of course my highlights of the day.
Okay. Excellent. So given how busy Jörn has been, I'm guessing a short week simply means longer hours during the days that you're working. But here, people may know I'm a member of a not-for-profit board which deals with LGBTQ rights. I'm the token cisgender, older heterosexual guy on this board. But our big event is this past weekend. Could not make it to DDW because we had, in our little town of 4,000 people, we had 20,000 people here on Saturday for a parade and a fair. It was pretty crazy. And by the end of the day, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. But that was simply my way of reminding myself as I get older, I have to work harder to stay in shape. And a remarkable day all around. A celebration. So I'm writing, Donna, I'm sorry I couldn't make it to yours. I just sent a note. It's a funny thing. I sent a note saying I couldn't make it. I got back a one-word response email, which was boo. Never seen a response like that before in my life. I said,
that was just to let you know that these are personal invites. I got that personally, and I was sad that you couldn't make it. And so that was my response, boo.
So I was as well. And 10 years from now, maybe I won't be involved with that organization anymore, or you do your 20th on a different
well, we have 3 more events. We have, coming up in Milan, associated with, of course, EASL just before, and then back here in DC before our Advanced Advocacy Academy with our patients, and then before the liver meeting with more of an innovation, digital health focus. So you have 3 more shots at this.
Good. We'll talk about Milan after we're off this call.
Okay.
So I know Jörn only had a few minutes. What I want to do is I want to go back to, we've actually been asking people 4 different questions about Stephen. And Jörn, I think the one that you kind of fell off, you talked about his mentorship to you and helping figure out how to do clinical trials in Germany. Let's jump in the middle, talk about his one most outstanding contribution to the field. And it's hard to come up with one because there have been so many. But if you had to pick one, or maybe 2, we can cheat a little bit, but not more than 2. First time I asked this question, someone listed 8. I said, gee, that's not 1 or 2. So just 1 or 2 particular contributions to the field. And they can be things other people have talked about before.
On the tough questions, right? So this brings me back to obviously sad memory of Stephen passing. And I think where we left off last time was that I mentioned that his energy was unprecedented from my perspective. His energy, talking about the disease to colleagues, talking to sponsors, wanting to move into the field, designing a clinical trial, talking to patients, enrolling them into clinical trials, talking to the regulators, to investors. So I think he was really, he was there as a lens, focusing that sunbeam that was needed to spark the fire and get the whole momentum into the field. I think that was one of his big contributions, that he was at so many places, with his energy, connecting so many people that eventually contributed to the success story, which in the end led to the approval of a first drug.
Jörn, let me ask you another one, okay? Because I know that you were involved early on in the formation of NAIL-NIT, which I think was a really important and innovative way of thinking about how do we get past biopsy. So if you want to comment a little bit about that, or if you could comment a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, Stephen clearly was a pioneer thinking about removing variability from clinical trials and uncertainty. So the field of NITs, or non-invasive tests, was something he's been dealing about for quite some time. And he's published a couple of landmark papers on the prevalence, but been fundamental in driving the development of non-invasive tests and some of the big research consortiums. So few people know that from the very beginning, he was there to actually co-design the LITMUS Cohort Study, which is a big study we conducted in Europe. He co-led one of the imaging work packages, and he was there from the beginning thinking about ways to establish non-invasive testing and push that forward, talking to the regulators, getting them validated, moving away from from biopsy in clinical trials. And NAIL-NIT follows the same pattern, I think, with his expertise and experience in running in clinical trials. NIT built on the large trial databases. We had a lot of very patchy databases or data sets that weren't connected. And knowing Stephen, he aimed big. And so he tried to pull everybody together, and he succeeded in NAIL-NIT doing so in quite a number of responses together. And I think that's what's unique about NAIL-NIT. And that data set has since then produced amazing data. Again, data will be presented in Milano now. I believe it's 8 or 10 abstracts. Stephen would have had an oral presentation of one of those. And now, unfortunately, he's not around to give that.
Yeah, very unfortunately. It'll feel like a different event for him not being there. Donna, you have thoughts you want to add or share on that topic?
Sure. I have a short and long answer. The long answer, giving context, because, as I approached this, I was wondering what else is there left to be said? You all did such a great job and really hit the mark and captured so many things on the first rounds. And I agreed that my teammate, Jeff McIntyre, captured one of my favorite phrases, that, some days the butter slides off your biscuit. And so I was thinking, what would I add to that? The first condolence comments I wrote about Stephen was about 2 hours before I buried my own mother. So in that space that morning, experiencing both losses, there was really no one else that I would have taken the time out to really acknowledge formally, except for Stephen, because he meant so much to me and to the organization and to all of us. And so a few people impressed me, few were astounded, and only a handful consistently surprised me. And Stephen always did. I'll talk more about a specific thought I had, but my short answer is NASH-TAG, in that is one of his, many creative entrepreneurial efforts and his, special way of bringing people together to solve problems. I think it really did provide a unique space for having smaller, more intimate conversations to work things out. So not only to present the science, but to have a particular type of conversations around the science and the different controversies and sometimes like the failures and the lessons learned so that we can pick ourselves back up. But that unique platform and space that he created at NASH-TAG has certainly had an impact on the field and will have an enduring impact, not just on, specific outcomes or approvals, but really how we all work with each other and understand each other and conduct conversations with each other. I would say, NASH-TAG was one of the things that I really appreciated, Stephen contributing and I was so privileged to be a part of as well.
That's great. So first of all, when I think of Stephen, I think of the idea that, A, we started the podcast, but B, we're 6 episodes into the podcast and it's the first week that we don't have something we know we're going to do. And I say to Stephen, what are we going to do? And he says, it's International NASH Day. So why don't we see if we can get Donna to come on? And Donna came on, talked about International NASH Day. I don't know that was the first time you met Louise, but it might have been. I don't recall that you saw each other before that. First time we met, and it was a great conversation. And one of the things that speaks to is Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book called The Tipping Point, which is about how ideas take shape. Right. And he identified there being 3 specific kinds of individuals who made things happen. Scientists, that is, people who understood the science of what was going on better or differently than anyone else did. And then there were connectors who, by force of personality, and had collected such a breadth of individuals around them that they always knew who to put together to make something happen. And then there were salesmen, and that's people who could take the idea and drive it. Many people are one of those. A few people are 2 of those. Virtually nobody is 3 of those, which made Stephen kind of a unicorn.
Yes.
Because he was all 3. That's the first part about bringing Donna to the party. Donna wound up being a fantastic guest host for a little while until she figured out she just couldn't fit that into her energy load and schedule, sadly for all of us. But the other thing about Stephen is I only saw Stephen's temper once, really. And Donna knows the story I'm going to tell. It's 6 episodes later, still the early days of the podcast, and Intercept gets their first NDA letter for obeticholic acid. And we decided to try to bring on the podcast somebody with a background in regulatory affairs. And a friend of mine made a recommendation who we brought on the podcast. She will go unnamed, but right now she's kind of smiling as I tell this story. And he proceeded to suggest that if the FDA had their way, they would do away with conditional approvals altogether. I thought Stephen was going to come through the phone at him. He was polite, but he was clearly ticked, to use a word, and it got louder and very, very questioning. And we played that back at a later point in time after the NIT workshop to talk about who was right on that issue and who was wrong. Now, I can't comment about what FDA people say at cocktail parties, but it's clear which way the science went on this. But it's the only time I ever saw anything really upset him. And it wasn't because he felt personally challenged, it's because all this was his baby and because what the guy said felt so wrong to him. It turned out not to be right. That is 2 clear memories of mine, bringing down to the podcast and then that particular topic.
Well, provocative statements make great great podcasts. So you're welcome. I think, though, Stephen connecting me to the podcast, which was pitched to a very business audience, industry audience, scientific audience, and making a space for the patient voice and doing things to support community initiatives as International NASH Day and now Global Fatty Liver Day really is for us, by us. It's for the entire community, by the entire community, but patient-led. And sometimes that doesn't hit everyone the right way. And so that was one of the main things I wanted to talk about today. I have so many instances across my career, and at the Association of Black Gastroenterologists and Hepatologists a few days ago, I had a chance to share some, whether from FDA committees or guidelines committees that I sat on or board meetings in hospitals and other places. But there is such incredible power when patient advocates and physicians work together and support each other. And Stephen was really unique in holding space for me, for my organization, for patient voices and the community with such a sense of mutual respect that we don't often get. And it allows us to then create new spaces together. And so I will be forever grateful for all the times he held space so that I could come in or bring a patient voice in or patient perspective. Often then he'd follow up and back me it by data or with something else to further lift the point I was making. But just if part of his legacy is more physicians holding space to allow their patient colleagues to come in and treating us with as much respect as Stephen did and being able to listen to us as much as we listened to and learned from him, I would hope that would be a great way to honor his legacy.
Interesting thought. Jörn?
Obviously, the role Gili and Donna have been playing in the field and advancing some of the successes that have been made, it's great to hear that this mutual support was there and felt on both sides. I know Stephen talked very positively about the patient involvement. It was always somebody who was very convinced that you have to tackle the problems from multiple sides. You guys started the podcast before I joined, so the first momentum or the first speed was into that mutual relationship, as you put it, Donna, from the very beginning. And the podcast, I think, was a small tool in that because it reached a broader audience than you could have through a conference or a hallway. I came to the podcast and it might have been that's how I got to realize GLI a little bit more intensively when I first actually started listening to the podcast.
Jörn, it's interesting you should say that, and Donna, because I know Stephen felt that way not only about patients, but also about allied health providers. That when the first time Louise showed up on the podcast, I don't think he was familiar with her background. In fact, when she showed up, I invited her 15 minutes before an episode because somebody had dropped out. But then he went back and he read up on who Louise was and said, this is really good. And allied providers don't get enough voice, and they need to. So again, his vision was just very wide, both wide and deep, but wide in this context, right? Patients, allied health providers, other specialists. I guess I hadn't realized, Don, until you said that at the beginning, he was one of the people who made sure to make space for patients, although frankly, I'm hardly surprised.
Stephen had such an ability to see clearly. So, and by that, I mean, see what needed to be done well ahead of many people and put the things in place to be able to accomplish them and to, stay optimistic, the happy warrior that he was, to stay optimistic and persistent until we got there. But to see long, before, as I think it was Manal's story about, standing in the poster group with no attention, but knowing that we were in the place that was going to, be the future. But he also was able to see people clearly, I think, in a way that whatever their title or whatever sector assignment or stakeholder group they were, from, he saw me as a fellow entrepreneur. He saw me as somebody like him who liked to build things. Many of our conversations were not about hepatology at all, but we were about being a high performance individual or creating high performance organizations. And how do you create structures that would more efficiently meet a particular need? I think what we really bonded as, people who like to get things done. And he saw that in me. I really am so grateful for that. I will miss one of the few people who really sees me.
Well, I'm not sure where to go from here because I think we've covered most of without asking all the specific questions I had in mind, we've answered most of them. Donna, do you have a Harrisonism?
I don't know. Maybe I laugh so hard or, they just strike me as so profound and perfect. I'm not that person who remembers the way. I am the person who will tell you the joke that you told me and say, well, see, am I right? It's a perfect joke for you. When I hear them, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That's a Stevenism. Just so no, I'm not the one who, I probably have a list somewhere if I look, but I just appreciated the humor and the crystallization of whatever people were trying to talk around and about. But I am neither that pithy nor sufficiently Southern enough to have them stick with me in that way, but I appreciated them as all get out.
So that's why you keep Jeff around, huh? So you can have someone who's pithy and Southern. And
we added somebody from Mississippi too, to double down on that.
So one of the things I appreciated about Stephen was the first time I said hotty toddy to him, he didn't know why I would know what that was. Jörn, if you don't know, hotty toddy is the core phrase of the major cheer at the University of Mississippi.
But wasn't never quite sure.
If you went to the University of Mississippi, saying hotty toddy was like living in Pennsylvania and saying we are. It's major universities tend to have one thing associated with their cheer. At any rate,
sounds like a drink, to tell you the truth.
Hotty toddy does sound like a drink. And in Mississippi, they probably drink it any time it got below 60 degrees because it's pretty warm there. The one I was thinking of today is just how Stephen picks stuff up. He used to talk about one of the reasons it was such a troubling idea to base everything on biopsy was that a biopsy was only 1/5,000th of the liver. And how could you possibly get samples out of that? Now, statistically, that's an interesting question. But I said to him one day after having 4 months into this podcast, I finally went to school on what a biopsy was entirely. And next time I heard him say that, I said to him afterwards, Stephen, it's not 1/5,000th. You're only taking 1/14th of what you're pulling out of the liver to be the slide. So slide is actually 1/700,000th. And sure enough, 3 weeks later, someone said to me at a meeting, I never realized this until I heard this from Stephen last week, but biopsy slide is only 1/700,000th of the liver. And his ability to pick up and integrate things that quickly was, I think, pretty compelling and cool. I probably have other Harrisonisms also, but I'm still compiling my final list of them. We've gotten into several of them so far.
We should all be so voracious in listening and learning from each other and taking the best things and moving them forward. I smile whenever I see anybody using we should get beyond the biopsy from a stage. My team is, really invested in trademarks and patents and stuff like that. I'm just like, I'm important that the idea is so infused that people have made it their own. I too really appreciate that.
So with that, I think this is about as long as any of the individual interviews have gone. Thanks, both of you. Jörn, good evening. Donna, thanks.
Thank you.
And here's our second interview with me interviewing Dimitar Tonev. So our second interview of this episode is with our friend Dim Tonev. Dim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm still under the impression of the tremendous loss we felt. Just came back from a major American conference, and I was looking around to see a familiar face and figure of Stephen Harrison, and we had a tribute to him at one of the MASLD sessions. So I still do not completely believe that he is no longer with us, Roger. I still don't get it.
You and several others. I'm going to want to talk about that in a second. I have one brief thing I want to say, and then I have a couple of things I'd love for you to do for us. First of all, this discussion with Dim, originally we were going to try to get Dim and Donna together yesterday. That didn't work, so we're doing them separately. This is the kind of discussion I would like to have with anyone who'd like to talk about their experiences with and feelings about Stephen. We will post this one as part of our weekly episode this coming week, but we will post others on the memorial page, and we will send them out as midweek special conversations for people to hear. So, Dim, since you've not been with the podcast before, I'd like you to do me two favors one at a time. First, take a minute or two and tell our audience about your background, what you do now, and how you got here. And we'll talk about how you came to work with Stephen in a minute. But let's just start with you.
So my name is Dimitar Tonev. I'm originally from Bulgaria, but spent the last 20 years working in different pharmaceutical companies developing treatments for liver diseases, mostly viral hepatitis, as well as NASH and cholestatic liver disease. That was out of London, currently based in Paris, and leading the medical franchise of a French company called E16, which inherited elafibranor from another French company called Genfit. So that's one of the connections with the NASH domain, the other one being Intercept, where I have spent a couple of years again running studies in this direction. I'm trained as hepatologist, but spent most of the last 10 years in drug development, as I said, and I know Stephen from the time when he was also interested in viral hepatitis and was able to see his gradual transition of his interest, scientific pedigree, and endless energy into the field of NASH, what we called NASH at the time. So that was a massively important journey, not only for him personally, but also for the entire field. So I was privileged to be one of the witnesses, and I hope one of his friends.
Okay, good. Before we go to Stephen, then one more thing. Can you please tell our audience one thing about you that they wouldn't know if you didn't tell them? Something a little different.
I'm a decent skier, and that's another connection with Stephen and with the rest of the team that it's organizing NASH-TAG every January. So definitely my favorite conference, not only because of the excellent skiing, but also because of the open spirit of communication and sharing, which is quite important for this field, and I always enjoyed immensely.
Okay, so interesting. In the tribute that you wrote to Stephen in LinkedIn, one of the things that you talked about was clumsy skier. So now that you mentioned that, I'm wondering if you have a skiing story with you and Stephen that ties in some way back to that description.
Yeah, that was probably not very polite, but Stephen was compensating, let's say, the lack of technical skills that Jörn is demonstrating with his power and sheer will. So I wouldn't necessarily say his skiing technique was really sophisticated. I've seen him a couple of times stumbling, but that's not really a particularly interesting story. I have another story to tell. When we reconnected in a discussion about NASH after the time when we were discussing, obviously, viral hepatitis C, when he was still with the army, with VA, that was in a restaurant in Oxford with a bunch of other guys. The CEO of a MRI company called Perspectum was there, and Stephen was sitting with his lovely wife and one of these chairs. One reason or another, I was quite, of course, impressed and a little bit shaky to meet the great professor. He just became an Oxford University professor at this point in time. So I was not very careful, and one reason or another, Stephen had left his glasses right next to his chair, effectively where I was sitting. So my first interaction with Stephen was effectively breaking his glasses. Well, it was not such a pleasant moment, I guess, for both of us, but I resorted to joking about this not being my, intention to, connect with him. But I think it altogether was a really funny moment, and we were remembering this a couple of times afterwards.
One of the really interesting things about Stephen was his ability to see the humor in everything.
He was indeed. He was able to turn some not always funny situation into something funny, or definitely something that you could learn from.
You said you looked around at I wasn't at DDW, but I'm sure that's going to be the way everyone experiences Milan. Stephen was just so much energy everywhere he went that I'm sure the vacuum is tangible. Tell our audience a little bit about how you viewed Stephen's role in the MASLD community and what it meant for you and your work.
I will bring a slightly different angle that I don't know whether anybody else was able to discuss. What was a massive contribution of Stephen, which is outside of pure science and enormous amount of publication and first authorships and presentation and conferences and stuff. What I think he changed in a really impressive way was the very practical process of patient recruitment into NASH, now MASH studies. So he largely created with the first iterations of Summit the idea of site network. And there was initially a bunch of friends of Stephen or former colleagues from military, which were having their own units and were interested to help him to recruit these patients. And that was initially ridiculed, but very, very quickly became such an impressive, I would say, organization that there was a time when big CROs that were spending, 20, 30 years trying to do what Stephen ended up doing in a couple of years, was so impressed by him that he was a preferred partner. His Summit network was a preferred partner to be bundled together with the rest of the units and research sites of the CRO in order for them to stand a chance to win business in NASH during bid defense meeting. He became a formidable delivery organization for patients in NASH trials, and I think that's something that very few guys are recognizing, but the CRO industry till this day is not able to replicate.
So that's interesting. What do you think is the magic or the special sauce behind how he made that work? And how much of that was about him and how much of that was about how he thought about it?
A couple of things that I'm aware. Of course, there are many, many secret and magical elements that probably nobody knows, or at least I don't know. I think there was a very rational idea, first of all, ago that we will have to create and deploy a pre-screening pathways. While we knew ever since what kind of histological features these patients need to demonstrate eventually when the two pathology readers agree on their NAS score and their fibrosis score, very few guys initially were thinking that this, to a certain extent, could be predicted by non-invasive technology. So Stephen was one of the first one that started thinking, okay, if I have a certain cap on FibroScan and a certain reading of traditional elastography again on FibroScan, this to a large extent will predict the potential for these patients to be approved for the study when the slide is finally seen by Zach Goodman and Pierre Bedossa. So the very idea to make sure that the patient is likely a good candidate for NASH study before he or she meets the biopsy needle. I think Stephen was one of the first guy that started to do that, and some of those, pre-screening pathways or selection of criteria that the patients will have to demonstrate to be considered for biopsy was created by him. And a little bit of technical jargon here. Most of the CROs will plan for NASH study a recruitment of approximately half patients per site per month. And Stephen I was able to see this with my very eyes, and probably applies to many other units outside of his own Pinnacle in the limits of Summit. We're getting to a level of 4 patients per site per month, which is massive and very, very difficult. And also required something else that he was doing. He was able to take his portable FibroScan. This is not meant to be an endorsement for the company or some of our friends that are providing these services as a commercial service, but was definitely a very pragmatic way to find patients. He was traveling with his portable FibroScan to certain communities where patients with obesity and multiple other risk scores were known to exist, and was offering, his screening services to many of these community in something we called outreach clinics, which is vaguely similar to something we were doing many decades ago in viral hepatitis, trying to find patients that are not so known to liaise with healthcare system very well. I mean, that's completely different type of patients as compared to Hep C, but definitely some smaller community patients which do not have probably excellent health care in rural Texas. And that's another innovation that I think Stephen utilized very, very successfully, as well as his charm. He was talking about these stories that it's a big family of patients with, Mexican origin, and he will get to know the mom. He will be her treater, and sooner or later there will be more and more family members coming to consult with him about their obesity and fatty liver disease and issues they are having. And many of those patients were indeed in need of certain care related to their livers, and probably a considerable proportion was also a potential patient that would appreciate and will be interested in clinical trials in NASH area.
So I don't know how much you know about how this podcast actually started, but you're getting pretty close to the heart of it. The podcast started because one of the other benefits of that kind of chain network recruiting is that if you needed to make an adjustment to an IRB, you could create a website, people could connect, and you could pretty quickly come to a consensus about what to do and get approval. Much, much easier than what would happen to the tertiary care institution. And when the pandemic struck, the COVID pandemic, people couldn't adapt quickly enough to the idea that you had to do biopsy in a place where patients didn't want to be touched and you couldn't give them in hospitals, and nobody knew how to get on top of this pandemic. But Stephen and some of his sites worked out a pretty pragmatic way to do it, and then needed to figure out a way to get that message out. And the initial message of the podcast, and if you go back to episode 1, all that way back, it's Stephen talking about how you can execute trials in the COVID pandemic, given that you've got to do biopsies and patients don't want to be touched. We put together 3 more episodes to buttress that. One about, how the investment community view that kind of thing. What issues does it leave for CEO, and what would a forecaster have to say? And then while we were doing that, we started getting letters from patients saying, tell me about my disease. And we decided we had to keep going. But it originally started exactly the place you're talking about. And with one of the unique benefits, in addition to being able to just recruit a lot more patients, the ability to be nimble to that particular crisis. So I'm intrigued to hear you say that.
His idea, I think, went in this direction direction even before COVID, and probably COVID crystallized this very idea to do clinical research out of tertiary unit and closer to patient homes and sometimes inpatient homes. But he was running ahead of the game even before that, because Summit was created at least, I would say, 5 or 6 years before the pandemic, if not even 10 years before the pandemic. And it was quite an interesting idea. Now, many are trying to replicate this, I don't know with what degree of success, because he is still the ultimate, power in MASH clinical trials. And I sincerely hope that his multiple companies will continue to be extremely helpful and to drive this clinical research forward. Massive contribution in a purely practical direction, because as I said, I'm not intending here to talk about multiple articles that he wrote and how he changed the overall field from a very depressive area when everything was failing to, I believe, a current situation when we have one product on provisional license and probably, hopefully, we'll have few more in the next few years.
Okay, so at the risk of being possibly redundant, you knew Stephen pretty well. What do you think were some of the personality traits about Stephen that enabled him to put that kind of thing together?
He was always able to demonstrate, and I was actually wondering how this is even humanly possible, an enormous capacity to work long hours. And while this ultimately probably was detrimental for his otherwise excellent health, I was hugely surprised that he was able to respond to text messages in 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. His time was then doing some sports, getting into clinics early, reading manuscripts and returning comments on protocols and papers late in the evening. So he invested an enormous amount of energy and manpower and willpower into this franchise that he was leading. And whether the years in the army was potentially responsible for cultivating this enormous amount of energy and desire and will to deploy all this energy for the greater good of scientific field, he was dedicated, because as I mentioned, he was not only and was not entirely a NASH key opinion leader. He had also massive amount of work and very successful papers, at least to my knowledge, in the area of viral hepatitis, mostly hepatitis C. So that was not a new phenomenon for me when I saw it, but after his retirement from the army, he had more time probably and a free rein to do things his own way.
You know, it's interesting. I think when you talk about the tremendous energy level and capacity to work on mindful of two things. One, a story that I think it was Katie Wack from Path AI told me as we were on the bus heading over to his burial. She said she doesn't sleep really well. I don't sleep really well. She asked Stephen about it and how many hours of sleep he got, and the answer was some ridiculously low number. And she asked how that worked, and he said, well, I sleep very efficiently. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not sure it worked out that way, but I thought the optimistic point of view and the belief that you could master sleep so that you could get less and still just keep rolling was very, very Stephen kind of thing.
He was, I believe, adding at least few extra hours to what other very active human beings will consider a very long working day. So he was adding 2, 3, 4 hours to the daylight. And that was probably the secret of how he was able to accomplish so much.
You know, but it wasn't just the work. I mean, he was that passionate about building his lake house. He would disappear. I remember one year he disappeared from MASLD for 36 hours because he promised he would take Anna Lauren to a concert. So he flew back to Texas, took her to the concert, turned around and flew back. He was that passionate about his family. He was that passionate, as I say. I remember when he was building the lake house and he would tell me every week about what was going on. I mentioned this on the podcast with Manal because this was a Manal thing. Every time we had Manal on, she would be in a different room in her house and Stephen would comment on the room and remember how it was different from the other rooms he'd seen before. He had a remarkable capacity for retaining tons of different information in different kinds and thinking visually. And then when you put that with all that energy, what you can get done in the day is pretty compelling. We're collecting Harrisonisms, special Stephen sayings, things people heard Stephen say that really struck them forcefully. Do you have any of those you can recall?
I remember a story which is one of my favorites related to Stephen, and hopefully nobody else have shared the story so far. But so the story goes how Stephen is coming back from, I believe, an ESO in the UK with his family, and they're enjoying the flight, watching telly. And one of his kids was complaining before the flight that the time in Europe was not sufficient. They were enjoying their time so much, so they were a little bit moaning that they're going back to United States. And So it happened that meanwhile, the flight attendant passed by asking whether there are medical practitioners on board. And one thing, you know the story?
No.
And one thing led to another. He, of course, immediately volunteered to be the medical practitioner that was needed. There was another passenger in distress with some stomach issues, abdominal discomfort, potential need for, surgery, let's say appendicitis or whatever. So the clinical signs were categorical. So Stephen suggested to the captain to turn around plane and to land at Shannon. They were passing by Ireland at the time, to land in Shannon in order for the patients to be able to receive a very urgent medical care. And he was joking with his kid, the very same that was moaning, because they didn't hear the conversation. They were with earphones. And he was saying, I've heard you being, so regretful that we are leaving. I've arranged for us to come back. And they, of course, didn't believe him. And he said, watch the screen. And that was hugely, impressive how this big plane slowly end up in a big curve going down to Shannon. And his kid was so impressed, was like, Daddy, you've really done it. So he was joking, of course, but look at what sense of humor and likewise, what an impression, what a lasting impression that should have been for his kid.
That's fantastic. Anything else about Stephen you'd like to share with our listeners?
I was very impressed by his honest scientific interest to sometimes smaller diseases, definitely diseases and franchises whereby there will be less so return of investment, whereby his time being his most precious commodity probably won't be utilized so successfully and immediately with loads of uncertainties. And I'll just give you an example. While he was on very, very short supply for all the companies that are developing therapeutics in NASH, he invested enormous amount of time and almost like free of charge to a small Danish biotech company that was trying to develop therapeutics in a completely new pathway, effectively inventing surrogates as they went in decompensated cirrhosis, not necessarily from MASH origin. It's just decompensated cirrhosis regardless of etiology. He provided time, precious advice, connected them with other like-minded people, was a real driver for their clinical development program. And that was just probably done in his free time. Very, very impressive, because you would assume a highly popular and very much needed MASH key opinion leader to stay focused in his main disease. But he was very able and willing to jump around into another, so to say, less important and completely unclear in terms of regulatory pathway disease, just to bring something new to the field. And I think advice provided and results achieved were really very, very good.
Is there one thing you can take forward in your life and in your work going forward, which you can say was like Stephen's special contribution to you?
Personally, he was able to reassure my doubts at a certain point in my career when things were not going really well. I do remember one or two NASH-TAGs before. I was sitting in the audience and was not in particularly good mood. I don't know how my own clinical studies were progressing at this point in time, but definitely a little bit depressed. And all of a sudden, Stephen quoted me as somebody that a good friend provided him with a couple of slides. And that was so kind. And you could immediately sense how the interest of others in the audience towards you, my humble persona, increased immensely, being quoted by Stephen Harrison from the podium for a slide that was not particularly, important from scientific standpoint, but just put together a couple of studies in an interesting train of thoughts. Hugely grateful for, bringing some of the spotlights that he was always operating under upon me in this particular case. And to a certain extent, allowing me to believe a little bit more, to trust my own kind of efforts will be successful a little bit more, definitely lifting me up.
That's a tremendous story and contribution on which to close this particular conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. And we'll be posting this tomorrow afternoon, actually, Thursday afternoon. Maybe you and I can get a cup of coffee in Milano in a couple of weeks. All right. In fact, I think the first time I ever met you in person was standing in line last year in Vienna. You turned around and introduced yourself. And I said, yeah.
I remember that. And you knew the name, which was a massive compliment for me.
Well, you're more present than you know. At any rate, thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to seeing you in Milan. Okay? Bye-bye, my friend. Okay? Bye-bye.
Thank you, Roger. All the best.
This week's question of the week is sponsored by Madrigal Pharmaceuticals.
As I mentioned on the podcast, I missed DDW 24 pretty much entirely due to a conflict with a weekend-long event for a nonprofit on whose board I serve. For those of you who attended or followed DDW, please help our other listeners out. What one paper or presentation struck you most forcefully? Why?
And now for the Season 5, Episode 16 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. It's becoming increasingly clear that the delay in sending arms to Ukraine over these last few months cost lives and territory that didn't have to be sacrificed. On morning television today, I heard a former Joint Chiefs of Staff member say that Russia will likely not take over Kharkiv, second largest city in the country. But avoiding that will require tremendous effort and energy and cost too much loss in lives, in property, in money. Let's hope our legislators never let our allies down this way again. Let's take a minute to honor the brave fighters in Ukraine and to share a debt of gratitude with the European countries, most, if not all, NATO members that have given substantive support and resources to Ukraine. On the other global hotspot front, last week in Israel, bodies of 4 hostages were found. This is one more reminder where this horror started. You can remember how evil October 7th was and not be pro-Netanyahu. For that matter, you can be a Zionist and not be pro-Netanyahu. I am a Zionist. I am not pro-Netanyahu. But with that said, let's take a moment to remember those who are still hostages in Israel, and also to remember how this god-awful situation started in the first place. Heroim Slava, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, people of Israel live.
Our memorial to Stephen Harrison goes on.
This week's focus is on having other friends and past colleagues of Stephen Harrison remember what made him special in their eyes. I do not expect we'll have another episode about Stephen, at least for a while, but we are looking to collect messages, written or audio, to keep posting on our memorial page and possibly as part of midweek conversations.
If you're a LinkedIn follower, look for an invitation message from us.
As I speak, it's Tuesday afternoon. Later this week, we'll begin sending our LinkedIn followers invitations to join our private membership. Members receive 3 major benefits. First, our weekly newsletter, which will discuss the previous and upcoming episodes, stories of interest to us, and at least one research paper each week. Second, we will be sending audience invitations so that members can listen to any episode in real time in our audience, and if you have a question, possibly come on the podcast to ask it. Third, I will be initiating weekly office hours shortly, and we'll discuss that in the letter as well. The letter will include a link for you to provide the information necessary for us to send you weekly news members and enroll you in our membership. Please join.
Next week's episode will be our EASL Congress preview.
Next week's episode will preview the EASL Congress that starts June 4 in Milano. We expect to have 2 or 3 EASL leaders with us to discuss the program. It should be special.
Our special extras will probably start at the EASL Congress.
There's an interview room at the EASL Congress. I expect to use this room to interview speakers who are presenting papers of significant interest, which we'll be putting out as conversations throughout the Congress. This will be our first use, I believe, of the special extras I've described over the last couple of weeks.
Good news on the listener front. Our first 1,000 download day of 2024.
Okay, not quite 1,000. We had 986 downloads last Thursday. Also, our Is Different launch episode has achieved the kind of lift that major news episodes were achieving last year. Thanks to everyone who keeps returning and listening and sharing with friends and colleagues.
This week's Volve conversation comes from our last drug discussion with Stephen Harrison.
At the end of last June, Stephen and Mazen Noureddin joined us to discuss major drug advances presented at the EASL Congress 2023. In this conversation, Stephen shares results from the Phase 2b FASCINATE-2 trial for denifenstat, a FASN2 inhibitor from Sagimet Biosciences. It includes everything best about Stephen as a presenter: clarity, energy, humor, and true excitement about drugs and development. We'll all miss this terribly. Well, that's it for this week. I want to thank our team, Jörn, Louise, Mike, Eric, Steve. As we keep moving forward, be on the lookout for conversations or new interviews in the next few days. Please take a listen to our question of the week and, of course, reply. If you're a LinkedIn follower, check your email or messages for an invitation to subscribe to our weekly membership, as I discussed, and we'll be back next week to discuss the EASL Congress 2024. Until then, stay safe, surf on, bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingmash.com and we will answer on the podcast or website. Your question might even wind up being the question of the week.